The coldest morning of that winter arrived without warning. No wind, no birds, just a heavy silence resting over the land like the world itself had stopped breathing. I remember opening my front door just after sunrise, expecting nothing more than another lonely day. But the moment the door creaked open, I froze. There, curled tightly on my porch, lay a massive black panther, her fur dusted with frost, her body frighteningly still. For a second, I thought she was dead. Then I saw it. The slow, fragile movement of her side, and beneath it, a swollen belly. She was pregnant. Every instinct told me to step back inside and lock the door. Panthers don't come to houses. They don't trust humans, and they certainly don't collapse on a man's porch unless something has gone terribly wrong. Yet she hadn't come here to hunt. She had come here barely alive, as if my home was the last place she could reach before the cold took her. What I didn't know then was this, that Panther had walked miles through deadly freezing darkness, carrying unborn cubs, running from a danger I had not yet seen. And before that morning was over, I would be forced to make a decision that could either save her life or cost me mine. But before I tell you what happened next, I want you to do something for me. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? And if stories about survival, unexpected bonds, and moments that restore your faith in life mean something to you, make sure you subscribe. Because when that panther opened her eyes and looked straight into mine, I knew my quiet winter was over. Morning had barely settled over the fields when I realized something was wrong. It wasn't the kind of wrong you hear or see right away. It was something you feel first, deep in your chest, like a quiet warning. Usually, even on the coldest days, there were signs of life around my property. Sparrows fighting over seeds, the distant rumble of a pickup truck on the county road, the wind dragging its fingers through the dry winter grass. But that morning, nothing moved. The silence was so complete it pressed against my ears. I kept my eyes on the panther as I stepped out onto the porch, every muscle in my body tight, ready to retreat if she so much as twitched. The cold bit straight through my boots, but I barely noticed. Up close, she looked even larger, powerful shoulders, thick paws, the kind of strength you don't argue with. Yet now that strength seemed drained out of her, like the night had stolen it. Frost clung to the edges of her whiskers, and each breath came slow and shallow, fogging the air for only a second before disappearing. Then her eyes opened. I cannot explain what it does to a man when a wild predator looks directly into him from only a few feet away. My heart slammed so hard I could feel it in my throat. But there was no anger in those eyes, no flash of aggression. What I saw instead was exhaustion, pain, and beneath it all, something that looked dangerously close to desperation. She tried to push herself up the moment she noticed me. One front paw shifted forward, claws scraping faintly against the wood. For half a second, I thought this was it. That instinct would take over and she would lunge. Instead, her legs trembled violently, and she collapsed back down with a low, strained sound that barely qualified as a growl. It was the voice of an animal that had nothing left. That was when I saw the blood. It stained the snow behind her, in faint scattered marks, already beginning to freeze into dull rust-colored patches. Not enough to suggest a fresh attack, but enough to tell a story of distance. She hadn't been injured here. She had walked like this, far, maybe miles, through a night cold enough to kill weaker creatures before dawn. Easy, I heard myself whisper, though I don't know why. Maybe the word was meant for me more than for her. My mind raced through every sensible option. Go back inside, lock the door, call wildlife control, wait where it was safe. Any reasonable person would have done exactly that, yet my feet refused to move, because as fear slowly loosened its grip, another feeling crept in. One I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time. Responsibility. The panther shifted again, and a deeper sound rolled from her chest, not threatening, just raw, with effort. Her head turned slightly toward her own body, and that was when I noticed a tightening ripple across her swollen belly. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough. She wasn't just pregnant, she was struggling. A memory surfaced then, sharp and unwelcome. Headlights swallowed by falling snow, tires sliding, my wife's gloved hand slipping from mine in the freezing dark years ago. I had learned the hard way how quickly winter takes and how rarely it gives anything back. "I couldn't save you," I muttered, before realizing I'd spoken aloud. The panther's breathing quickened, each inhale shuddering through her ribs. Whatever had driven her here had drained the last of her strength. If she stayed exposed on this porch much longer, the cold would finish what the night had started, and the tiny lives inside her would never even see the world. A sudden crunch echoed from the far edge of the yard. I lifted my head instantly. At first, I saw nothing but white fields stretching toward the tree line. Then my gaze dropped and found them. Tracks. Large ones. Too large to belong to her. They circled the outer boundary of the property before disappearing toward the woods again, as if whatever made them had been watching from a distance, waiting. A chill far deeper than the winter air slid down my spine. She hadn't just come here for shelter, she had come here running. I stood there far longer than I should have, staring at those tracks until my eyes began to blur from the cold. Every instinct told me I was no longer alone out here, that somewhere beyond the tree line, something had followed her, something patient enough to circle my property without once stepping into the open. The thought tightened my chest. Living alone teaches you many things, but the most important is this: when the land goes quiet, it is rarely without reason. Behind me, the panther released a weak, strained breath that pulled my attention back. Up close now, I could see her sides trembling uncontrollably. The cold was sinking deeper into her muscles, stealing whatever strength she had left. A thin layer of ice had begun forming along the darker patches of blood near her hind leg. "You didn't come here by mistake," I murmured. Carefully, slower than I had ever moved in my life, I stepped back toward the door without turning my back on her. Every small movement mattered. Predators read sudden motion like language. When my hand finally reached the knob, I slipped inside and shut the door gently, the click sounding far too loud in the frozen morning. For a moment, I simply leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. This was no longer just shock. It was a decision waiting to be made. From the kitchen window, I watched her again. The rising sun cast a pale gold light across the porch, but it brought no warmth. She shifted slightly, and her head drooped lower, as if even holding it up had become too heavy a task. Then I saw it, another tightening across her belly, longer this time. My stomach dropped. Labor. Not fully, not yet, but close enough that time was no longer on her side. I grabbed the phone hanging beside the refrigerator and dialed Wildlife Rescue with stiff fingers. The line crackled before a tired voice answered, already overwhelmed by storm calls from neighboring counties. Roads were icing over again, he told me. Crews were stretched thin. The soonest anyone could reach my property would be a few hours. Maybe more if conditions worsened. A few hours. I looked back toward the porch. She didn't have a few hours. When I stepped outside again, the air felt even sharper, slicing into my lungs. The panther's eyes followed me immediately, still alert despite her weakness. There was fear there now. Not of me, I realized, but of everything closing in around her. Pain does that. It strips creatures down to their most honest state. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said quietly, though my voice carried a tremor I couldn't hide. Her ears twitched at the sound. For a second, the tip of her tail moved. Not aggressive, just aware. I stopped several feet away, giving her space, remembering something I had once read. Wounded animals don't attack because they want to. They attack because they believe they have no other choice. The wind shifted suddenly, dragging a bitter gust across the porch. She shuddered hard, and a low cry escaped her throat. softer than before, but filled with exhaustion. It was the kind of sound that settles somewhere deep inside a person and refuses to leave. And in that moment, the debate inside me ended. I turned toward the barn. The heater in there was old, heavy, and stubborn as anything built 20 years ago, but it still worked. Dragging it through the snow took more effort than I cared to admit. The metal screeched faintly with every pull, and more than once I froze, worried the noise might startle her. Yet when I hauled it onto the porch and set it down, she did not lash out. She simply watched, her breathing uneven, her strength nearly gone. "You're tougher than you look," I muttered, though the truth was the opposite. She looked like a creature balanced on the thin line between life and surrender. As I reached to plug the heater into the outdoor socket, I noticed something else along her flank. Long, jagged claw marks cut through her dark fur, half hidden beneath frozen blood. Not clean like a hunter's strike, but violent, desperate. Whatever had done that hadn't been small. My eyes drifted back toward the distant woods. The track suddenly made terrible sense. A contraction rippled through her again, stronger this time. She lowered her head and drew in a sharp breath, her body curling tighter around the life she carried. Steam from the heater began to curl into the air, barely visible but growing. "You made it this far," I said softly. "Don't quit now." For the first time, her gaze held mine without wavering. And something passed between us then. Not trust, not yet, but an understanding. Two survivors standing in the same brutal winter. Just as I began to believe the worst danger was the cold, a faint sound rolled across the fields, a distant, echoing cry. Not hers. My head snapped toward the tree line. The sound came again, low, rough, and unmistakably predatory. Whatever had chased her was still out there. That sound did something to me I had not felt in years. It pulled me instantly backward into a memory I spent most winters trying to outrun. Fear out here is different from the fear people talk about in towns. It is older, quieter, and far more patient. I kept my eyes locked on the tree line, waiting for movement, but the forest revealed nothing. Just rows of frozen branches standing like silent witnesses. Still, you don't live alone this long without learning when you're being warned. Something was out there, and it hadn't given up the trail. The panther must have heard it too. Her head lifted slightly, ears angling toward the sound, and for the first time I saw something awaken behind her exhaustion. Instinct. Even on the edge of collapse, she was ready to protect what was inside her. A slow, protective curve formed through her body as she shifted her weight, as if placing herself between the unseen threat and her unborn cubs. That sight settled heavily in my chest, because I recognized it immediately. I'd seen that kind of protection once before, years ago. Before this house grew so quiet, winter used to mean laughter echoing across these fields. My wife, Eleanor, loved the cold in a way that never made sense to me. She said snow simplified the world, turned everything honest and clean. On storm nights, we would sit by the fire while she read aloud, her voice steady against the wind rattling the windows. And when our boy was small, he would press his face to the glass at dawn, searching for animal tracks like they were messages written just for him. Then came the night that rewrote everything. The forecast had been wrong. They often are out here, and what began as light snowfall turned vicious before we could make it home from town. I still remember the way the road disappeared beneath the tires, how the headlights reflected back nothing but white chaos. One moment we were moving, the next we were sliding. Metal screamed, glass burst, and then there was only the cold. I tried to get her out. God knows I tried. But the storm swallowed every sound, every signal, every chance for help. By the time the rescue truck found us, the cold had already taken what it wanted. After that winter, the house felt too large, every room echoing with absence. Friends suggested I move closer to town, start over somewhere warmer, somewhere less lonely, but leaving felt like another kind of loss. So I stayed. Over time, solitude became less of a choice and more of a habit. And yet, standing on that porch now, staring at this wounded mother who had dragged herself miles through killing temperatures, one thought pressed harder than all the others. The cold had already taken a family from me once. I was not about to stand by and watch it take another. A strained movement pulled me back to the present. The panther attempted to rise again, legs trembling violently beneath her weight. For a heartbeat, she almost made it upright, powerful shoulders lifting, claws gripping the wood, before her strength gave out. She collapsed with a heavy thud, a broken sound leaving her chest that no creature should ever have to make alone. Her sides fluttered rapidly. "You don't have to fight anymore," I found myself saying, my voice lower now, steadier than before. Strange how quickly fear begins to lose ground when purpose steps in. The heater had started pushing a thin wave of warmth across the porch, just enough to keep the frost from thickening on her fur. I grabbed an old wool blanket from inside, the same kind Eleanor used to drape over our chairs, and paused at the doorway. Every sensible part of me argued against what I was about to do. A wild panther is not a creature you approach. One flash of instinct, one surge of adrenaline, and I wouldn't even have time to regret the mistake. But when I stepped closer, she did not bare her teeth. She only watched. Carefully, slowly, I spread the blanket along the boards a short distance from her, letting the warmth gather there. The wind tried to snatch it away, snapping the fabric sharply, and for a split second her muscles tensed, then relaxed again. She understood, in whatever quiet language animals carry, that I meant no harm. Another contraction rolled through her. This one was stronger. Her breathing hitched, and she turned her head toward her belly, eyes wide with a confusion that struck me deeper than fear ever could. Even the strongest creatures look small when pain finds them. That was when I noticed fresh snow scattering lightly across the far end of the yard. Not falling from the sky, but drifting loose from branches disturbed too suddenly. My gaze sharpened. There, just beyond the fence line, a shape moved between the trees, large, deliberate, watching us. The panther let out a low warning, barely louder than the wind, but it vibrated with the last of her strength. She knew it was there. Maybe she had known all along, and in that moment the truth settled over me with chilling clarity. She hadn't chosen my porch only for warmth. She had chosen the one place where she believed a predator might hesitate to follow, which meant, whether I liked it or not, whatever was hunting her was now standing at the edge of my land. For several long seconds I did not move, did not even dare to breathe too deeply. My eyes remained fixed on that narrow gap between the trees where I had seen the shape pass. At my age, you learn not to question your instincts. They are usually the only reason you're still alive. Something had been there, not the wind, not imagination. Something heavy enough to disturb snow that had been resting untouched since before dawn. The panther sensed it too. A faint rumble gathered in her chest, so low it was almost more vibration than sound. It was not the roar of a hunter. It was the warning of a mother with nothing left except the will to defend. Watching her try to summon strength she no longer had did something unexpected inside me. Fear was still there, of course, but it was no longer in control. I stepped forward slightly, positioning myself closer to the outer edge of the porch without fully realizing what I was doing. Perhaps it was foolish. Perhaps it was instinct older than logic. The same instinct that once made me reach for my wife in the wreckage instead of saving myself first. The forest went still again. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the tension in the air loosened just enough for sound to return. The creak of frozen wood, the distant crack of a branch settling under ice. Whatever had been watching seemed to retreat deeper into the trees. But the message had already been delivered. She was not safe yet. As I turned back toward the panther, my eyes caught something along her wounded flank that I had been too distracted to fully process before. The claw marks were deeper than I thought. Long, tearing gashes that no ordinary struggle could explain. This had not been a territorial spat. It had been an attack meant to bring her down. Only one animal in these parts leaves wounds spaced that wide. A large male, likely starving after weeks of failed hunts in the snow, and a pregnant female, slowed by the life inside her, would have been an easy target. "You fought him off," I whispered, almost in disbelief. The idea of her battling through the darkness, injured and alone, then walking mile after mile until she found this porch. It shifted something in me. This was no helpless creature. She was willpower wrapped in muscle and bone. A sudden tremor ran through her body, stronger than the last. Her head dropped, jaws parting as she pulled in a sharp breath. I saw the muscles along her belly tighten again, longer this time, harder. Another contraction. Too soon. Snow began falling again, lightly at first, thin crystals swirling sideways in the wind. I looked toward the road beyond my property, already fading beneath a pale sheet of white. Wildlife rescue would never make it in time if the storm returned full force, which meant the responsibility had quietly passed to me. I moved back inside just long enough to grab more blankets and an old thermos of hot water. When I stepped onto the porch again, she tracked every motion but did not resist as I nudged the heater closer, letting the warmth gather around her fragile space. Steam curled faintly from her fur as ice began melting into dark streaks. "You're not dying here," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. As I crouched, still keeping what I hoped was a respectful distance, I noticed something half hidden beneath the drifting snow near the steps. At first, it looked like nothing more than a broken branch. Then I saw the dark stains spreading slowly outward. More blood, fresh. It did not belong to her. My eyes lifted immediately toward the tree line. If the male was wounded too, it meant only one thing: desperation. Injured predators take bigger risks. They come closer to farms, closer to houses, closer to people. The panther let out another low sound, weaker now, her strength draining with every passing minute. Yet even then, she angled her body protectively, refusing to expose her belly toward the forest. Watching her stirred an old ache inside me. The memory of Eleanor squeezing my hand once during a winter blackout years ago, whispering, "We protect what we love. It's the simplest rule there is." Another contraction seized her. This time she did not even try to rise. Her claws dug into the blanket, breath shuddering violently, and that was the moment the truth settled fully into my bones. The cubs were coming. Here on this porch, with a wounded predator somewhere nearby and a storm threatening to swallow the road. I straightened slowly, scanning the white horizon, understanding with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Whatever happened next, I was no longer just a man who had opened his door to a wild animal. I was the only thing standing between that mother and everything waiting in the cold. The snow began falling in earnest not long after that realization settled into me, the kind of steady, wind-driven snowfall that erases distances and swallows sound until the world feels smaller than it is. Within minutes, the far fence posts blurred into pale ghosts, and the tree line faded behind a shifting white curtain. I knew then that no one would be reaching this property anytime soon. Out here, a storm doesn't ask permission. It simply closes the roads, the sky, and sometimes even the space between one heartbeat and the next. And somehow, without ever agreeing to it aloud, I understood that this porch had become a place of waiting, and that I was now part of whatever fate had brought this wounded mother to my door. The panther's breathing grew heavier, each exhale rattling faintly, as if pulled through pain, before escaping into the cold air. I could see the effort it took for her just to remain conscious. Every few minutes, a tremor ran through her powerful frame, reminders that strength alone cannot outrun nature forever. Yet even now, with life pressing hard against her from the inside, her gaze drifted again and again toward the yard, toward the forest, measuring the distance to danger. That protective instinct never dimmed. Watching it stirred something deep in me, respect, certainly, but also a quiet sorrow because I recognized the cost of that kind of vigilance. It is exhausting to guard life when you are barely holding on to your own. I stepped back inside briefly and returned with another armful of blankets, layering them carefully along the boards to block the creeping cold beneath her. Each movement was slow, deliberate. By now, a strange calm had settled over me. Not the absence of fear, but the kind that grows when a person stops asking whether they should help and simply accepts that they will. I poured hot water into a metal bowl and set it near the heater, letting steam rise into the bitter air. The warmth was modest at best, but even modest warmth can tip the balance on a morning like this. "You've carried them this far," I said quietly, unsure whether the words were meant to comfort her or steady myself. "You're not finishing this journey alone." For a moment her eyes met mine again, and what passed there no longer felt like mere tolerance. It was not trust. Trust is too large a bridge to build so quickly, but perhaps recognition. Two living beings, both marked by winter in different ways, sharing the same fragile stretch of shelter. Another contraction tightened through her, longer and unmistakably stronger. Her head dropped, jaws parting as a strained breath escaped. Instinctively, I took half a step forward before catching myself. You do not interfere with a wild mother unless she allows it. Still, I stayed near enough that if the wind shifted or the blanket slipped, I could set it right without delay. The light strengthened slowly as morning climbed higher, though the sun itself remained hidden behind thickening clouds. Snow gathered along the porch railing, softening every edge. It would have been almost beautiful, if not for the tension threading through each passing minute. Then, through the hush of falling snow, I caught it, a faint crunch from beyond the yard. My head turned sharply, not loud, not hurried, just the careful compression of snow beneath weight. I rose to my feet, every sense sharpening. The storm distorted distance, but something about that rhythm made the hair along my arms lift. I walked to the edge of the porch, peering into the white blur until my eyes adjusted. At first, nothing, then movement. A shape slid between the trees, larger than any deer, darker than the trunks themselves. It did not step fully into the open, only lingered where shadow and snowfall could hide it. But I felt its focus as surely as if it had called my name, the male. He had followed her trail, and he was patient enough to wait. For the first time that morning, real fear surged back through me. Not the startled fear of discovery, but the cold, calculating kind that measures odds. A starving predator does not surrender an easy kill, and a laboring female is the easiest prey nature ever creates. Behind me, the panther released a low, gathering growl, weak, yet threaded with defiance. She knew he was there. Perhaps she had known since she collapsed on this porch, choosing proximity to a human over certain death in the open. The thought struck me with sudden force. She had not come here only because she was dying. She had come here because she believed he might hesitate to approach a house, which meant my presence mattered more than I had imagined. I stepped down off the porch before I could second-guess the decision, boots sinking into fresh powder. The cold wrapped instantly around my legs, but I kept moving until I stood a few yards from the steps, visible, upright, unmistakably human. My heart hammered so loudly I wondered if the animal could hear it across the distance. For several long seconds nothing changed. Then the shape shifted. Not forward, but back. Slowly, reluctantly, it retreated deeper into the trees until the storm swallowed it whole. Only then did I release the breath I'd been holding. When I turned back, the panther was watching me with an intensity that rooted me where I stood. Perhaps she understood what had just passed between hunter and witness, or perhaps she simply sensed that for now the immediate threat had eased. "You're safe," I said, though we both knew safety out here is never permanent, only borrowed in small increments. As the hours crept forward, her strength continued to wane, but her body pressed onward with the ancient determination of motherhood. The contractions grew closer together, each one carving deeper lines of strain through her posture. Snow collected along her back again, melting faintly near the heater before freezing at the edges. Time felt stretched thin, every minute carrying the weight of consequence. Then just past midday it happened. Her body tightened unlike before, not a wave, but a force that seemed to gather from every remaining ounce of strength she possessed. She drew in a sharp, trembling breath, claws gripping hard into the layered blankets. And in that instant I understood with absolute clarity, the waiting was over. Life, fragile and stubborn, was about to enter this frozen world, on the weathered boards of an old porch, under a sky heavy with snow, guarded by a man who had once lost everything to winter, and who now stood determined that this time the cold would not be the one to decide the ending. I had witnessed many harsh things in my lifetime. Storms that flattened barns, winters that starved entire herds, nights so cold they seemed to crack the earth itself. But nothing prepared me for the quiet intensity of that moment. The world felt as though it had drawn in a breath and refused to release it. Even the wind softened, falling into an eerie hush as the panther's body tensed with a force that belonged not to fear, but to creation. She lowered her head, jaws parted, pulling in short, strained breaths that fogged the air before vanishing into the cold. Every muscle along her powerful frame tightened, then trembled. I stayed exactly where I was, resisting every human urge to rush forward. Nature has its own rhythm, and interfering at the wrong moment can turn help into harm. Still, my hands hovered uselessly at my sides, my heart pounding with a helpless urgency I had not felt since the night my son was born decades ago. That same fragile balance between terror and hope. Another contraction came, longer than the last. A low sound escaped her throat, not quite a cry, not quite a growl, something older, deeper. Snow gathered silently along the porch rail, while steam curled faintly from the heater beside her. The warmth barely pushed back the winter, but it was enough to keep the ice from claiming her completely. Then I saw movement near her hind legs. Small, unbelievably small. For a moment my mind struggled to understand what my eyes were seeing. The shape glistened faintly against the blanket, barely larger than my forearm, motionless, except for the faintest twitch. The first cub had arrived. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, the sound trembling on its way out. The panther shifted weakly, instinct urging her to clean the newborn, but exhaustion pinned her in place. She tried to lift her head, failed, and tried again with the stubbornness only mothers seem to possess. "You did it," I whispered, my voice breaking despite the cold. But the cub did not move much, and panic flickered through me. The temperature alone could steal that tiny life within minutes. Without allowing myself time to reconsider, I removed my heavy wool coat and stepped closer than I ever thought I would dare. Every nerve screamed caution, yet the panther only watched me, her eyes heavy but alert. Slowly enough that even the falling snow seemed faster, I knelt and used the edge of the coat to shield the cub from the wind. I did not touch it, not truly, only nudged the fabric so warmth could gather around its fragile body. For one suspended second, the panther's gaze locked onto mine. No teeth, no warning, just acceptance. It was the purest form of trust I had ever been given, and it humbled me more than fear ever could. A faint sound rose from the tiny creature, a thin, wavering breath. Relief washed through me so suddenly, my knees nearly weakened. Life. Against every brutal intention of the storm, life had found a way in. But the moment of wonder did not last long. The panther's body tightened again. Another cub was coming. Snowfall thickened, the sky darkening prematurely as clouds gathered overhead. I glanced toward the tree line out of habit, half expecting to see that shadow return. Instead, the forest stood unnervingly still. the kind of stillness that often means a predator is near but unseen. As if sensing my thought, the panther released a low, warning rumble despite her fatigue. She was telling the unseen world that she was still here, still dangerous, still a mother. "You rest," I murmured. "I'll keep watch." And I meant it. Time blurred after that. Minutes stretched and folded into one another until the second cub arrived, smaller but louder, its fragile voice threading through the cold air like a promise. The mother managed to shift just enough to draw them closer, curling her body protectively despite the toll it clearly took. Standing there, snow settling across my shoulders, I felt something inside me thaw that I had believed frozen forever. For years, winter had only reminded me of what it had taken. Yet on this porch, beneath a sky heavy with storm, it was giving something back. Not what I had lost, never that, but something quietly miraculous all the same. I thought the hardest part was behind us. I was wrong, because just as the fragile cries of the newborn cubs faded into the wind, a sharp, distant roar tore through the forest, closer than before, and this time it was answered by silence. The roar did not linger. It cut through the air once, deep and commanding, then vanished as if the forest itself had swallowed it. Yet the echo of it settled into my bones. Distance is difficult to judge during snowfall, but instinct told me what my mind did not want to accept. He was closer, much closer. The panther heard it too. Despite everything her body had endured, her head lifted instantly, ears forward, eyes sharpened by a fierce and ancient awareness. A protective rumble rolled through her chest as she curled herself tighter around the newborn cubs. Watching her gather the last scraps of her strength for them stirred something almost reverent inside me. There is no force in nature more determined than a mother guarding her young. Not hunger, not cold, not even fear. I stepped off the porch again, scanning the whitening horizon. Snow now fell thick and fast, the kind that muffles approaching footsteps until danger is nearly upon you. For a moment, I saw nothing but shifting grey and white. Then, between two skeletal oaks near the edge of the property, movement. A large figure emerged briefly from the veil of snow, lower to the ground than a deer, heavier through the shoulders, dark, watching. Even at that distance, there was no mistaking the tension in the way it held itself. The patient focus of a predator measuring risk against reward. The male had returned, drawn by scent, by instinct, perhaps by the faint cries that had already begun to drift beyond the porch. My pulse hammered so loudly it seemed impossible the creature couldn't hear it. I knew, with a clarity that left no room for debate, that if he decided to charge, I would never reach the door in time. Yet something steadied me. Not bravery exactly, but the quiet refusal to step aside and let violence finish what the cold had failed to claim. Without breaking eye contact with the distant shape, I backed slowly toward the woodpile stacked beside the house. My gloved hand closed around the old iron poker I used for the fireplace. A pitiful defense against an animal built for killing, but it was something. Then I did the only other thing I could think of. I made myself look bigger. Standing tall at the edge of the porch, I raised my arms and shouted into the storm. Not words at first, just sound, raw and sharp, the kind meant to fracture that careful predator calm. The noise tore at my throat, vanishing quickly into the wind, but it carried far enough, the shape froze. For several endless seconds, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, the male stepped forward just enough for the pale daylight to brush across his flank. Even through the curtain of snow, I could see the lean hunger in him. Ribs faintly visible, winter etched into every hard line of his body. A dark stain marked one shoulder. Injured. That explained the desperation. He stared straight at me, unblinking, weighing whether the fragile lives on my porch were worth the gamble of confronting a human. I felt very small in that moment, but I did not step back. "Not today," I said, my voice low but steady. "You don't get them today." Perhaps it was the movement of my arms, or the unfamiliar silhouette of a man refusing to retreat, or simply the last thread of caution predators must keep if they wish to survive. Whatever the reason, the tension shifted. He angled his head slightly, nostrils flaring, snow collecting along the ridge of his back. And then he turned, not in panic, not in defeat, just a slow, deliberate withdrawal into the trees until the storm erased him completely. My knees nearly gave out once he was gone, relief rushing through me so fast it left me dizzy. I stayed where I was a long moment longer, just listening, making certain the forest had truly reclaimed him. Behind me, the cubs released thin, wavering cries, and the mother answered with a soft vibration that barely rose above the wind. When I looked back at her, something in her gaze had changed. The sharp edge of alarm had softened into something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to recognition. "You're safe," I told her again, though this time the words carried more truth. As the afternoon light struggled behind thick clouds, the snowfall finally began to ease, and with that easing came a distant sound I had been hoping for but hardly expecting anymore. The faint grind of tires fighting through slush somewhere beyond the road. Rescue. It took nearly another hour before the truck appeared through the pale haze, crawling toward the house like a stubborn promise. 2 wildlife officers stepped out, their expressions shifting from professional focus to open disbelief the moment they saw the scene on my porch. "Well, I'll be," one of them muttered, pulling off his hat. "You stayed with her." I nodded, suddenly too tired to form many words. They worked carefully, voices low, movements practiced, scanning her injuries, checking the cubs, preparing a transport strong enough for a mother who had every reason not to trust them. One of the officers glanced toward me after a long moment and said quietly, almost to himself, "She walked close to 10 miles, by the look of her tracks, probably while already in labor. 10 miles. Through claw wounds, through freezing dark, through a storm. Not random, not blind, chosen." As they prepared to move her, the older officer studied me with narrowed eyes. "Strangest part is, panthers don't come near houses unless something in their past tells them humans aren't always the enemy." At his words, a memory surfaced, buried deep but suddenly clear. Years ago, after Eleanor was gone, but before the land felt quite so empty, I had reported poachers cutting through these woods. They'd killed a female panther not far from the creek. I remembered finding her, remembered leaving food out there for days afterward when we realized she'd likely had a cub somewhere. We never found it, until now, perhaps. I looked at the exhausted mother curled around her newborns and felt a quiet certainty settle over me, like the first warmth after a long winter. She hadn't come here by accident. She had come home, to the only place her earliest memory might have whispered was safe. As the officers lifted her gently onto the transport, her heavy eyes found mine one last time. No fear, no anger, just a long, steady look that seemed to hold more understanding than I could ever explain. And in that silent exchange, I realized something I had not felt in years. For the first time since that terrible winter long ago, the cold had not taken from me. It had given something back. The storm passed quietly during the night, as if it had simply grown tired of its own fury and drifted away toward some distant horizon. By morning, sunlight spilled gently across the fields, turning the endless white into something almost golden. I stood at the same kitchen window where this story had begun, a mug of coffee warming my hands, watching thin curls of steam rise into the calm air. It was strange how quickly the land could transform. Only a day ago it had felt hostile, merciless even, and now it rested in a fragile peace that made the world seem newly washed. The house was quieter than it had been in years, but no longer heavy. There is a difference between empty silence and peaceful silence, and for the first time since Eleanor's passing, I could feel it. Wildlife officers had returned just before dawn to tell me the mother and her cubs made it safely through the night. They had settled her into a protected rehabilitation enclosure not far from the northern ridge, somewhere secluded enough that she would not feel trapped, yet safe from roaming predators while her strength returned. The cubs, they said, were small but stubborn, already louder than their size suggested. One of the officers even laughed softly when he told me, shaking his head like a man still trying to make sense of something rare. "Most people go their whole lives without seeing a panther," he had said. "You invited one onto your porch." Invited. The word lingered with me long after he drove away. Days slipped by, and though winter still held the valley in its grip, the sharp cruelty of it seemed dulled somehow. I found myself stepping outside more often, scanning the tree line without quite admitting that I hoped to see a shadow there. Not out of worry anymore, but out of a quiet, unfamiliar anticipation. Nearly 3 weeks later, the snow began to melt in earnest. Patches of earth surfaced again, dark and alive beneath the thaw. That morning, I walked the edge of the property checking the fence, when I noticed tracks crossing the softened ground. Small ones, several of them. My pulse quickened as I followed the prints toward the yard. They came from the direction of the northern ridge, weaving clumsily through the mud the way only young animals move, curious, unsteady, discovering their legs, and beside them, unmistakable even in partial thaw, her tracks. I did not move, did not even dare to shift my weight as the familiar shape emerged from the trees. The mother panther stepped into the open with the same silent grace I remembered, though she looked stronger now, her stride steady, her coat restored to a deep midnight sheen. Winter had not defeated her after all. Behind her tumbled 3 small cubs, their dark fur catching the sunlight as they stumbled over one another, stopping every few feet to investigate this enormous new world. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then her eyes found me, no fear, no urgency, just that same steady awareness, calm, intelligent, remembering. I cannot say how long we held each other's gaze. Time does something peculiar in moments like that. It stretches wide enough for understanding to pass without the burden of language. One of the cubs wandered too far toward the porch, pawing curiously at the step where it had first entered the world. She nudged it gently back with her nose, never once looking away from me. "You made it," I said softly, the words carried off by the mild breeze. Something loosened in my chest then, something I had been carrying since the night Eleanor died. A quiet guilt for surviving when she had not, for never being able to wrestle her back from the cold. But watching this mother stand strong beneath the winter sun, her cubs alive because she had refused to surrender, because in some small way I had refused too. That old weight finally began to ease. After another moment, she turned. The cubs gathered around her legs, tripping over patches of melting snow as they followed. At the edge of the trees, she paused once more and looked back. Not long, not dramatic, just a brief acknowledgement, the kind shared between travelers who had survived the same storm. Then she disappeared into the forest, her cubs tumbling after her, their tiny tracks stitching new life into the thawing earth. I stood there until the last trace of movement vanished, the sunlight warming my shoulders, and for the first time in many winters, I realized something simple and extraordinary at once. The cold will always visit this land. Storms will come, silence will fall, and loss will remain a part of loving anything at all. But sometimes, when you open your door instead of turning away, winter brings more than it takes. Sometimes it leaves you with proof that life, no matter how fragile, is stubborn enough to begin again.